Good evening, everyone. It's a huge honour to be here. I'm Chris van Tulleken. I'm an NHS doctor. I'm a Professor of Infection and Global Health down the road at University College, London. And I've had a very long relationship with London Zoo. I want to acknowledge that we're in the bicentennial year, that the 200th anniversary of the zoo. It's also the 200th anniversary of UCL. And there's a huge amount of really, really special stuff happening at ZSL at the moment. The theme of this evening is One Health, and that's why you've got a human doctor, both a doctor who is a human and a doctor who treats humans, introducing other scientists and experts who deal in animal health. And what we're going to discover this evening is this concept of One Health, that human health and animal health, that planetary health and public health are inextricably tangled. And it is impossible to solve the problems of one without solving the problems of the other. Now, my relationship with London Zoo began a long time ago. I grew up nearby, so I used to come as a child. And I long had an affection for animals in the way that we all do. And then when I became a human doctor, I was a frustrated vet, really. My grades were not good enough to become a vet, so I became a human doctor. This is the dirty secret of human medicine, that it's far, far harder to become a vet. You needed 5 A's at A-level, and I only had 3. So many years later, I was doing a PhD in HIV and HIV molecular biology. And I'd done a little bit of work on chimpanzees in Uganda, studying parasitic infections in chimpanzees. And my boss at the time was Greg Towers, who's a virology prof at UCL, now at QMUL. And he got a call from the zoo saying one of the gorillas, Keisho, their main breeding gorilla, was unwell. And he knew that I'd done some non-human primate work, so I went to the zoo to collect a urine sample. And I was absolutely gutted because when I arrived at the zoo, Yedra, the vet, was outside with this urine sample and just wanted to hand it over. And of course, I wanted to see the gorillas. So I said, look, as a doctor, as a clinician, I really like to see my patients. I don't just do investigations. So Yedra opened the doors and I went backstage in the gorilla enclosure. And this was the beginning of an incredible relationship where we assembled a team of primate experts, both human primate experts, because humans are apes, we're primates, and non-human primate experts, the vets at the zoo and the wider scientific community. And we began a series of investigations trying to understand what some of the health problems with the gorillas were. And in fact, it was a hematologist at the Royal Free who was the one who discovered that the main breeding gorilla, when they counted the chromosomes under the microscope, had an extra chromosome. And this explained why the breeding program wasn't going well. So we didn't figure out the infection, but we did do some incredible science. And we built then a relationship that was ongoing and is ongoing today. That's why I'm standing here, where the human infection doctors, we looked after malaria in the penguins. You may not know that birds get a form of avian malaria, and it's transmitted by mosquitoes that we have in London. We have the vectors here, just as we have the vectors for human malaria. And migrating birds bring malaria back from the tropics. And so we had a pot of out-of-date human anti-malarial drugs that we used to treat the penguins. And then one day, one of the vets said to me, did I know anything about insulin dosing for, I think it was one of the vultures who was diabetic. And at this point, I realized I was really being quite fraudulent, and I wasn't an avian endocrinologist, and I had to stop sort of pretending. So I confessed I didn't know about that, but it really was a very long and happy relationship, and it's massively informed the broadcasting that I've done over the last 15 years at the BBC about the risk of pandemic disease, which is more in our minds than ever as we see hantavirus has just completed more human-to-human transmissions than ever before in human history, and just as that threat seems to be receding, so we have an outbreak of Ebola being announced in DRC for which we don't have a working vaccine. So this link between animal health, both of those viruses have animal reservoirs, and human health has never been more pressing. And I told the story of my relationship with the zoo and with Keisho on the Wildest Moments podcast, and I'd really urge you all to go and listen to that incredible series. It's part of the celebrations. And the other thing I really want to point you all toward today is that the ZSL is announcing a new wildlife health centre, and this is going to be an incredible place for both basic research into vaccines, into fungal biology, into anything you can think of, but also a place where animals get treated and an education centre. And this is going to be, I think, a really, really important animal health hub in London, and it's going to be a focus for One Health Biology. I want to tell a short story just to clarify in all of your minds the link between human and animal health. Sometimes when we talk about the concept of One Health and we describe these very dangerous infections that we are increasingly worried about, we see more and more infections with pandemic potential moving into the human population, what we call emergent infectious diseases. It's easy to think that the natural world is our enemy. It's a reservoir of things that might kill us, and perhaps there would be a logic to eradicating bits of it, to exterminating parts of it. And that logic can be very appealing for some people. My own expertise before I became a nutrition scientist and a global health expert was HIV. And there's a paradox in HIV, in the history of HIV, that you can go to the place where we know the virus jumped from non-human primates, from chimpanzees into humans. And we know it was a single jump, and we know it was a single virus that led to the infection that has infected 60 million people and killed 30 million of them. And that jump happened at the borders of Central African Republic and Cameroon, near the Sangha River. And the peculiarity of this outbreak is that the indigenous communities living in the forest always have had a low or non-existent rate of HIV infection. And the crucible where HIV first got going after the jump was in Kinshasa, in Democratic Republic of Congo, hundreds of miles away. And it's always been a mystery that we can go and we know exactly where the virus jumped, and we can date it using a thing called a molecular clock. We know it happened between 1910 and 1920. And Jacques Pepin is a French-Canadian epidemiologist, and he did some incredible work that I think only someone with a historical background, he's also got a history degree, could have done, where he went and worked out what was happening in the forest at that time. And there was an obscure front being fought between Belgian and German soldiers, enslaved Congolese soldiers, who had been taken from Kinshasa and brought into the forest, and there was no food. And so they began hunting for bushmeat and for primates. And it was this war that we're pretty sure that the conflict happened near Mulundu in the forest at the point where that troop of chimpanzees with a very closely related virus lives. We're pretty sure it was that hunting that led to the transmission. There are no known exceptions to the rule, none that I know of, that the risk of pandemic disease arises and increases when we abuse and degrade and destroy our ecosystems through war, through commercial interest, through human activities that are harmful to them. And when we nurture our ecosystems, we protect them, we protect the animals, but we also protect ourselves. Now my research is very much focused, and some of you will be aware of this, on the global food system, which we might call the ultra-processed food system. And I think the food system is where it is the nexus where all of these issues meet. If you care about the risk of pandemic disease, if you care about animal welfare, if you care about antimicrobial resistance, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, plastic pollution, climate change and carbon emissions, all of these, the primary driver is the modern food system. And so that is now what is really maintaining my link as an infection scientist, someone who started in infection. The food system is still where all those risks come together so pointedly. So this is an incredibly exciting time to be here, and I'm so happy to be welcoming our other speakers to the stage. You're going to hear about some of the work that this new centre is going to be doing. You're going to be hearing about other links to One Health. And I really now just want to get on with the other speakers and introduce them. First of all, we've got Javier Sánchez Romano. Now, Javier, I'm not going to read out your whole bio because it's long. All of you have very long, impressive biographies. You're a veterinary virologist, so we share a virology background, with extensive experience studying the links between wildlife, domestic animals, and human health, and trained as a veterinarian in Spain, has a PhD in infection biology from UIT, the Arctic University of Norway, and Javier's done work all over the world, and now at ZSL is working on major projects in Central Asia and in the Western Congo Basin about biodiversity conservation, zoonotic disease prevention, community collaboration, and real-world impact. So Javi's work is really sitting at the nexus of animal health and human health. So Javi, welcome to the stage, and I'll let you take over. Big round of applause to Javi.
That's me. I'm Javi. And first of all, I would like to take the time to thank you all for being here today. I'm a research fellow in One Health at ZSL's Institute of Zoology. And what I want to do in the next 10, 15 minutes is to show that the health of the animals around us, the health of the ecosystem, and our own health are all together. They are one thing. I wanted to start with why do we care about animal health? But before that, I want to ask you all, what is health? What do you think health is? Any takers? We have some souvenirs if you answer. So, disease-free. Someone answer around here. Yeah, but someone in there. Yeah, disease-free. But to me, I think health is more than just the absence of disease. It's a state of well-being, and that applies not only to humans and to us, but also to animals and the ecosystem. But why do we egoistically care about animal health? And I think there are many reasons to be egoistic and care about them. One of them is that there are over 1 billion cases of disease every year coming from animals. Around 3/4 of all new infectious diseases that have emerged in the last 30 years are zoonotic, so that means that they originated in animals and now are affecting humans. And about $500 million are spent every year because of zoonotic diseases, from lives lost and from economic disruption. So the boundary between human and animal health is much closer than we think, and that makes animal health pretty much our problem. It's not their problem only. Then we jump into what is One Health. So how many of you have heard of the topic here before? Who knows what One Health is? Well, not that many. I thought there would be more, but yeah, we will go through it a little bit. One Health is the understanding that the health of humans, animals, and the ecosystem is not just connected, but they are fundamentally one. You cannot protect human health without caring about animal health, and you cannot care about both animal and human health if you don't care about the ecosystems. Now, when most people talk about One Health or think about One Health, we think about zoonotic diseases, so infectious diseases that go from animals into humans. But that's only one point of the whole picture. One Health also encompasses land use and changes in biodiversity and biodiversity loss, chemical pollution, antimicrobial resistance, climate change, and food safety and food security. So we cannot think about any of those things independently. They are all kind of together, and we have to manage them together to be able to kind of fight all the health problems that we may have. So I think One Health is not just a scientific framework, it's a way of asking the right questions. And that's what I hope that we will go through in these presentations that we have today. The best way to understand One Health, I think, is not through definitions or kind of scientific words and stuff, but through stories. And I bring 2 stories today here. One in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, that happened in 1998, and one happening possibly in a park very close to your home, here in the UK. So in 1998, there were a kind of mysterious disease that started affecting pig farmers and people working with pigs in Malaysia. It was something that no one knows about. Like, clinicians were a bit kind of like struck with what's happening here. And by the time the outbreak was controlled, 105 people were dead and more than 1 million pigs were killed. So we are talking about huge numbers of animals and people affected by this. The culprit was a new virus. It's called Nipah virus. And one thing we need to understand is that to understand where this virus came from, we don't have to look at the pigs or at the people in the hospital. We have to look at the forest. And this is what was happening there. So we have a forest that is being stripped away and is replaced by palm oil farms. And this is not history. This is something that is happening all the time in many places on the world. So it's happened still in Southeast Asia, it's happening in Africa, and it's happening all over. The consequence, deforestation pushed the bats to change their location. They went from their natural habitats into areas where intensive pig farming was happening. The bats started roasting where pigs were living. So they were eating there, they were kind of like dropping fruits. Fecal material was going down, urine, a lot of things coming from the bats into the pig sties below. And then the pigs became infected by this virus. They act as amplifying hosts. They develop disease. And then the people working with the pigs got the virus and got very sick. So basically, the chain was the bats were happy living in their forests, doing their life. The intact forest and bat habitat was cleared, was destroyed. They had a fragmented habitat that led them to move into the pig farms. The pigs got infected and sick. More than 1 million pigs dead and destroyed. And yeah, 105 people that ended up dying there. This is One Health in practice. If you look at the three circles that I showed before, environmental health, animal health, and human health, the main disruption came from the environment. It was the habitat destruction that led to all these things. The pigs got sick, people were sick and died, but the outbreak is where all these three things overlap together. The Nipah outbreak was only solved when a lot of different people with different backgrounds started working together. We have scientists, veterinarians, ecologists, social scientists, public health specialists, all working together as a single team. Looking at the pigs alone didn't get an answer. Treating the people in the hospital didn't give an answer. It was looking at how the bat ecology and how the bat behavior has changed that we were able to identify the problem and solve the issue. And that is One Health. Then, something much closer to home. We do not need to travel to Malaysia to have a One Health example. The next one can be very close to your home. Do you know where this is, by any chance? Richmond Park. You can throw bats to everyone in here. Richmond Park. I assume you have all heard about Lyme disease. Yeah, Lyme disease is caused by a bacterium and is transmitted to humans by these guys, a species of tick. It's the most common tick-borne disease in the UK, and we have about 2,000 to 3,000 cases reported annually, but probably there are many more cases that are not really reported, and so it's underdiagnosed, and cases have been rising more and more and more and more every year. This is a life cycle of the tick. So you have the adult tick that will produce eggs, and then it goes through two different phases, larva and nymph. Each stage requires that the tick will feed in a different host. The adult tick most commonly feed in big mammals. In the UK, the deer is the most often host for the ticks. Then they will put the eggs, the larva will come out, and then when the larva and the nymph are involved is when the real story about Lyme disease begins. In these early stages, they feed in small birds and mammals. And this is the point where the bacteria spread happens in the system. They are much better hosts for the bacteria than the deer, and these guys are kind of eating and getting the bacteria with them. Occasionally, in the middle of this, a human or a dog wanders around the park. They are not part of the cycle. They are not what the tick is looking for, but they are close enough, and then the tick will bite, and then we will get the bacteria on us, and we will develop Lyme disease. To understand why cases are rising, we need to understand all the cycle and all the animals and the ecosystem they live in. The primary reservoir are these guys, bank balls and good mice. These two small mammals are very, very efficient and multiplying the bacteria. And then when the tick will bite one of the infected ones, they will get a lot of bacteria into them. Rats may also be a harbor, like for Borrelia. We have a lot of them around. Then we have gray squirrels. How many of you have seen a gray squirrel in the last week? All of you, probably. They are present virtually in every park in London. They are less efficient than these other guys, but still they are a lot. And what they are doing is to being a buffet for ticks. They are around, more ticks can feed, the population of ticks will kind of increase and explode, and then you have a lot of options to have a tick that is feeding in these other guys and have the chance of being infected by Borrelia and infecting you after. Small birds, particularly the ones that feed in the ground, are also part of the cycle. They can be infected by the bacteria, they can be bitten by the ticks, and then they can be kind of part of the system. But yeah, we are focusing more on the rodent side than on the birds. Then, one more factor, we have climate change, and climate change is accelerating all these things happening here. These maps show the temperature anomalies in the UK in the last decade compared to like the previous 30 years. And what you don't have to understand the maps, you don't have to focus on them. The darker the red is, the bigger the anomaly is. It's hotter compared to how it was 30, 40 years ago. But we are talking about ticks here. Why do we care about climate change? Anyone want to kind of explore it? Any? Yeah?
Breeding, sir. Longer breeding period.
Longer breeding period.
They can survive for longer.
They can survive for longer. So on one hand, we have a warmer and wetter winter, right? So they can survive better during the winter. On the other hand, we have a longer spring, summer, and autumn because the temperatures are increasing. So the period of the year where the ticks are reproducing and going through the cycle of larva and nymph is much longer than before. So we have much more chances to being infected than we have when the reproduction period for the tick is smaller. So yeah, the window of risk for bit bites is longer, and it will probably be increasing kind of as time passes and climate change continues to warm up our weather. Then we have a little bit of what happened in an unbalanced ecosystem. In a healthy, biodiverse ecosystem, we have a lot of predators. We have foxes, weasels, stoats, barn owls, kestrels, buzzards. They are all eating rodents. And they are keeping this small mammal population on balance. But if we think about the urban and peri-urban areas that we have here in London, predator density is very low, except foxes, that they are everywhere, but many of the other ones are not really visible in this urban and peri-urban system. When predators decline, due to many things, habitat fragmentation, persecution, habitat loss, many reasons, the rodent populations can explode. And then, yeah, you have more things that the ticks will feed on, and this kind of cycle explodes in a way. So what happened at the end is that we have more rodents, we have more ticks, we have maybe more ticks infected by Borrelia, this bacteria that produce Lyme disease, and then we humans have more chances of being infected. This is sort of what is called a trophic cascade. You remove the predators at the top, and then you are affecting all the way to the bottom the humans. We are not in the trophic cascade, but we are kind of ended up being affected by changes in it. Then, this is a map of where you can find Ixodes, the tick that is the host for the bacteria that cause Lyme disease in Great Britain. And this is the area where London is, so we can see there that we are completely surrounded by tick territory. Richmond Park, Hampstead Heath, Bushy Park, all of them have active tick populations, and they have deer. That is a kind of main host for the adult ticks. They all have gray squirrels, they all have rodents, and even if they all have foxes, this is a small part of the predator population that will be necessary to control the rodents and have a functioning ecosystem. So, as a summary, we can say that Lyme disease is not a disease from the countryside, as many times people think. It's like you don't go to walk in the forest, you will not get ticks and get Lyme disease. It's an increasingly disease in urban and peri-urban ecosystems. And I think London is a textbook example of all this situation. So both of the stories that I talk about, Nipah virus and Lyme disease, share a common structure. In the surface, we can think that these are human diseases, and these are a problem that only affect us. But in reality, this is a medical problem that have roots in an ecological problem. You cannot solve these issues only with human medicine. You have to incorporate all these other things, like human medicine, ecology, veterinary science, all this. So we need a lot of people working together in these problems. So we don't have to only ask how can we treat a disease, but how can we solve the ecological problem behind how these diseases are being spread. And we have to think on how we can change the conditions that make this system happen. So that to me is One Health. It's not just a framework to create a response to an event. It's something that we can use to prevent the spillover of diseases from wildlife into humans. So, yeah, to me, I think One Health starts a bit with curiosity. You kind of like question how the health of a bat in the forest, the health of the bank bowl in the garden, or the health of the fox in the back of our street ends up affecting our health as human. That was all for me. Thank you so much.
Javi, thank you so much. So I, as an infectious diseases doctor down the road at UCLH, I treat a lot of patients with Lyme disease or suspected Lyme. And instead of us ever considering those upstream effects, what we have is a growing industry on Harley Street and on Devonshire Place of clinics that charge patients incredible amounts of money to probably misdiagnose Lyme and then give them enormous quantities of antibiotics, further generating antibiotic resistance and contributing to the problems of One Health, rather than us speaking to you. So, Javi, I think I'm going to drag you in for a grand round at the hospital. I think I'm going to do that with all three of you, actually. That's going to be my payback. Next up, we have Rosie, who's been at ZSL for almost 9 years, almost 10 years, did her PhD here with the Institute of Zoology and is now a postdoctoral researcher where she studies cetacean strandings, so marine mammal strandings, and works at the Ocean Predator Lab at the Institute of Zoology. And her particular interest is how marine predators are stressed by human-made problems like chemical pollution and noise pollution. So, Rosie, you are intimately connected to One Health. Welcome to the stage, and thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks everyone for coming along and to hear us chat tonight. So today I'm going to talk about one particular aspect of One Health, and I'm going to focus on chemical pollution, as Chris mentioned. So I'm a marine biologist here at the Institute of Zoology, and my research focuses on the health of marine mammals around our coast. So I'm going to explore One Health through that specific lens, using marine mammals as an example of how the health of our environment, wildlife, and ourselves are all closely connected. So I'll be drawing on work that we've done here at ZSL to show how chemical pollution moves through marine ecosystems and what it can tell us about not only the health of our seas, but also the health of wider planetary health and why it matters beyond just the wildlife alone. So before I dive in, I wanted to just flag something important further to what Javi said, in that chemical pollution doesn't just exist as a problem in isolation. It overlaps and interacts with many of the other pressures that we know about under this One Health umbrella. So for example, we know that exposure to pollutants can make animals more susceptible to infectious disease and zoonotic diseases like Javi talked about, but it can also worsen the effects of climate change and make that animal less resilient to climate change and vice versa. So while the focus of what I'm going to talk about today is on chemical pollution, it's really important to keep that bigger picture in mind. So before I get more specifically into marine mammals, I wanted to tell you a bit more about where these pollutants come from in the first place when we talk about chemical pollution. And the answer broadly is mostly from us. So many of the chemicals that we find in the environment begin life in human industry, agriculture, consumer products, or waste systems. So they include things like flame retardants to stop things going on fire, so like your sofas and car seats and things like that, pesticides, industrial chemicals, heavy metals, pharmaceuticals, and then things like the so-called forever chemicals, which you might have heard of, referred to as PFAS, and they're used in everything from waterproof coatings to non-stick materials. So a lot of the time, these chemicals are actually very useful in their properties, but very harmful to the environment and our own health. And they can enter the environment in lots of different ways. So some are released from manufacturing, some come from wastewater, sewage overflows, landfill, runoff from farming systems, or just everyday household products being washed down the drain. Others come from what's known as legacy pollution. So these are chemicals that were banned decades ago, but they're still circulating because they're so persistent and don't easily break down. And then once they reach our water systems, so our rivers, our estuaries, our coastline, they don't just disappear. Some of these chemicals can persist for decades. They bind to sediments, they can enter plankton and small fish, and then they move up the food chain. So by the time they reach top predators, like marine mammals, they can be present at much higher concentrations than they were in the surrounding water. And human activity creates and releases these chemicals. They then move through the environment, they accumulate in marine mammals, and ultimately, as sort of sentinel and indicator species of marine ecosystem health, these animals can tell us more about the health of our environment, but also possible impacts to human health where our diets overlap. So why is there so much focus on marine mammals when we talk about chemical pollution? Well, the short answer is that they're some of the most polluted animals on our planet. So they have several biological characteristics that make them particularly vulnerable to accumulating high levels of pollutants. So firstly, they often have this thick layer of blubber, which is a thick layer of fat that surrounds them, and it has lots of useful things like it will help with thermoregulation, it helps with energy storage. But a lot of these most harmful pollutants that we're talking about are fat soluble, meaning that they bind to fat, and so they accumulate in this blubber over time. Secondly, marine mammals feed high up the food chain, and I talked about how these pollutants can accumulate up the food chain. So with many of them being apex predators, that makes them much more vulnerable to accumulating these pollutants that biomagnify up the food chain. And thirdly, marine mammals are quite long-lived as a species, and so these pollutants are notoriously difficult to metabolize and break down. And so the longer an animal lives, the more it will accumulate over its lifespan. And the reason that marine mammals are useful in a One Health context is that many of the pollutants we find in them are moving through the same ecosystems that support our food sources as humans. So in some parts of the world, people consume marine mammals directly, and that creates an even more obvious link between animal health and human health. So when we study chemical pollution in marine mammals, we're not just asking whether these species are at risk, although I think that's very important. I'm a bit biased, but I do think that's important. But we also use them as indicators of broader marine ecosystem health. So moving on a bit more into our work here specifically at ZSL into chemical pollution and marine mammal health, I wanted to introduce one of the projects that ZSL leads, which we particularly look at this issue within, which is the Cetacean Strandings Investigation Programme, or known as CSIP for short. And just to flag that the word cetacean is a collective word for whales, dolphins, and porpoises. So CSIP is a government-funded programme that covers England and Wales, and our job is to investigate all causes of mortality in stranded cetaceans, seals, marine turtles, and large-bodied sharks. And the project's been running for over 35 years, which means we have records now on 18,000 strandings. We've carried out 5,000 post-mortem examinations, and from those we've obtained detailed health data and also identified causes of death. And through those post-mortem examinations, we've collected 150,000 biological samples which are stored within our tissue archives here in London and can be accessed to carry out research and collaborate with us. But they're also an amazing resource to understand chemical pollution in these animals. So I'm just going to brag a little bit about our amazing data set that we have here at ZSL. And I wanted to visualize some of that data that we have, which to the best of our knowledge is the world's largest cetacean database that we have on pollutants. So the figure on the left is showing you stranding locations of a few different species that we find around the UK. And those dots are colored by the species and sized by the pollutant burden in each of those animals that's stranded. And as I mentioned, animals that feed right at the top of the food chain and are the longest lived accumulate the highest levels of some of these pollutants. And you can see that reflected here in those large green and orange dots. So those are our killer whales and our bottlenose dolphins, which within the UK are the longest lived and feed at the highest trophic levels. And the figure on the right is showing you the harbour porpoises, which are really useful species for trying to understand chemical pollution because they strand in high numbers compared to other species, and you can see they're really nicely distributed around the UK. And that allows us to look at trends in both time and space of specific chemical pollutants around the UK in those animals so that we can understand things like whether mitigation actions are working properly and also which areas we should prioritise actions for conservation for these animals. So what does chemical pollution actually do to these animals in the environment? So I wanted to focus on two key modes of harm today, although there are several more, unfortunately, than what I'm going to be able to cover. And the first of those is reproductive impacts. So there are several ways that pollutants can affect reproduction. So they can impact a female's chance of conceiving, they can increase the likelihood of stillbirth, and they may also reduce male fertility by affecting sperm quality. But I think the most striking mechanism, unfortunately, is what happens to calves. So I mentioned that these pollutants bind to fat, and that means that they accumulate in that layer of blubber that I mentioned, but it also means that they can be transferred directly from a mother to a calf via milk, because these animals have very, very high fat milk. And so a newborn calf can receive an enormous pollutant burden at the most vulnerable stage of its development, and in cases this unfortunately can often be fatal. And I just wanted to show you a figure from the literature here back in 2006 by Ailsa Hall that modeled this effect, whereby you can see the maternal concentration of a group of pollutants known as PCBs and how that relates to the probability of a calf surviving more than 6 months, and this is in bottlenose dolphins. And you can see there's that inverse relationship, whereas that maternal blubber concentration increases, the chance of that calf surviving, unfortunately, has a big reduction. And then our own work here at ZSL has looked into this in a little bit more detail. So we compared these concentrations of these pollutants known as PCBs across age classes in our strandings data set. And you can see that adult males in the green there had the highest levels because they have no way to offload their pollutant burden. Adult females had the lowest, having passed on much of their pollutant burdens to their calves if they successfully reproduce. And then juveniles sit somewhere in between. And so we're finding that reflected in the stranding animals around the UK. And when we looked a little bit more closely at how these pollutants are being transferred in the milk, so PCBs are actually a group of 209 different chemicals. And we tried to look within our data set at the dynamics of how these pollutants are transferred in that milk. And unfortunately, we found that calves are receiving a disproportionately neurotoxic mixture at exactly the time when their brains and nervous systems are still developing. And then bringing it back to our health as humans, marine mammals are eating many of the same fish that we eat from the same contaminated oceans. And the NHS reflects this reality in its dietary guidance. So girls and women of childbearing age are advised to eat no more than 2 portions of oily fish per week, compared to 4 portions for boys and men. And the reason is the same. So pollutants can build up in the body and reduce fertility. And so marine mammals and humans are both facing the same risks from the same pollutants. And it makes me really angry, this one specifically, I think, that these chemicals, these specific chemicals, PCBs that we've talked about, were banned decades ago, and you still see that girls are having to eat half as much of this fish, which we know otherwise is good, omega-3s, all of those health benefits, and they're not able to do that because of decisions made by chemical companies 50 to 70 years ago. But the second major effect that I wanted to talk about is immunosuppression, where exposure to pollutants weakens the immune system, making animals more susceptible to disease. So if you think about what that means at a population level, we've talked about how pollutants can reduce the number of births through these reproductive impacts, but they can also increase the number of deaths in a population through this greater disease vulnerability. So you're having a double whammy at a population level. And that can be a really serious conservation concern for species that are particularly vulnerable and might be vulnerable to other human impacts, like bycatch, for example. So this is a picture of Overhang, which is a male bottlenose dolphin that stranded in Cornwall in 2017. And the cause of death in this animal was deemed as generalized bacterial infection. So there were clear signs that this animal had a debilitated immune system. And it would have been quite a slow and painful death that this animal suffered from what we saw. So it had very large parasite burdens, abscesses. There was a mandible infection that had led to the loss of several teeth. The animal also had a deformed jaw. And these impacts were thought to be associated with particularly high levels of these pollutants, PCBs, that I talked about. And studies in the laboratory have backed this up. So when researchers measured immune function, specifically an endpoint known as lymphocyte proliferation, a marker of immune response, and plotted it against PCB concentrations using sort of in vitro or in-laboratory techniques, they found a clear inverse relationship again. So the more pollutants that were present, the weaker that immune system response was. And again, bringing it back to our work here at ZSL and what we're seeing in wild animals, we were able to use what's called a case control approach to try and study if we were seeing this signal in our stranded animals. So this is the same method that would be used in human epidemiology, so the type of method that you use to find links between smoking and lung cancer, for example. So what we did was we compared levels of these PCBs in the blubber of animals that had died from infectious disease with those that had died from other causes, so known as trauma, so sort of bycatch, caught in fishing nets, or maybe hit by boats or something. And we found that in those animals that had died from infectious disease, they had significantly higher levels of these pollutants. And then we were able to model that risk, which is the figure on the right, and you can see that increase in risk of an animal dying from infectious disease mortality as the PCB blubber concentration increases. And then when we bring it back to humans again, the numbers are unfortunately sobering. So pollution is estimated to cause 9 million deaths globally each year. So to put that in perspective, that's 3 times the number of premature deaths caused by HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. So it accounts for 1 in every 6 deaths worldwide. I should say that these numbers include air pollution, and I've been generally talking more about chemical pollution, but at least 2 million of these deaths were attributed to chemical pollution, and that is thought to be an underestimate, because it is very difficult to attribute these things. As I've hopefully shown you, there's never really a smoking gun. We see a debilitated animal and high levels of pollutants, and it's the same as, again, attributing to someone's death from lung cancer being to do with smoking. There is not a smoking gun to attribute these deaths, but we're able to use techniques where we can pretty conclusively show impacts. So this isn't a niche environmental concern. It's one of the leading causes of preventable deaths on the planet in humans. And the economic cost is equally staggering. So exposure to preventable environmental chemicals is estimated to cost around 10% of global GDP in health-related impacts. And when we look at one specific class of pollutants, so those PFASs that I mentioned before, which you'll often see referred to as forever chemicals, the projected costs reach anywhere from $500 billion to $2 trillion by 2050 in the EU. And what makes this particularly frustrating from my point of view is that, well, particularly when we talk about PFAS, safer alternatives often exist. So the problem isn't technical, it's economic and it's political. And there is not sufficient incentive for companies to switch, and legislation, unfortunately, hasn't kept pace with these problems. So the better regulation and economic incentives to drive the adoption of safer chemicals and the development of safer chemicals could present an enormous amount of harm to wildlife, to ecosystems, and to us. When we talk about millions of deaths and trillions of pounds, it can really feel abstract. But the animals that we study, I feel, are a reminder that this pollution, it's measurable and it's already having profound effects through our shared environment. We see the deaths that these debilitated animals have to deal with, and you may have seen about killer whales carrying around their calves that have died for days and days and days. So it's troubling when we see these impacts. And I just think I want to reiterate that One Health means recognizing that our health and theirs are not separate, they're deeply connected. And so it's really win-win when we can do things to tackle issues around One Health. So I just wanted to close by talking a little bit about what you can do. So I've mentioned that I think the economic incentives and that it's more of a systems level problem. And I do think that is true. We need to reduce inputs, we need stricter regulation, we need better wastewater treatment, and we need to ban and phase out these harmful chemicals more quickly when we realize they're causing harm. Having said that, there are things that we can do on an individual level to try and help this problem. So the first is choosing safer products. So reducing harsh cleaning agents, pesticides in the garden, things like that. Cutting our plastic waste, avoiding single use. So the plastic industry results in a huge amount of chemical pollution that's associated with plastic production. So that's a really big win if we can try and do that. Disposing of chemicals responsibly, so never pouring medication or paint or chemicals down the drain or throwing, the end of your prescription or tablets in the bin. There are safe ways that we can get rid of those to stop them entering the environment. Advocating and engaging, so supporting policies, joining citizen science initiatives, raising awareness, and then voting for parties that have the right policies to deal with these problems. And then finally, voting with your wallet. There are brands who are trying to do sustainable alternatives and build and develop sustainable chemicals and products. It's really important to vote with your wallet if you can and support those brands. So I know, for example, just even by Googling PFAS-free waterproof clothing, you are helping raise awareness. Brands are looking. North Face, for example, if you search on their website for PFAS-free clothing, they will see that, and they will see that there is more consumer demand for those things. So they're small things, but I think that's what we need to shift the momentum to make sure that these companies understand that it's what we want and generate those incentives for them to make that change. So I just wanted to finish by thanking a huge amount of people that are involved in CSIP. Obviously, collecting all of that data over 35 years is a huge collaborative effort. So I'd just like to specifically shout out Rob DeVille, Matt Perkins, Simon Spiro, and David Kernick for all of their help with this work. Thanks very much.
Rosie, thank you. Another incredible talk, and it is incredible if you go on the NHS website and you look at the foods you should feed your new baby. It's quite sensible advice. And then there's a list of foods you should not feed your new baby, including, of course, oily fish, marlin, swordfish. And we're advising about, in a way, a public health crisis that doesn't exist. There are no instances of marlin poisoning in toddlers. The problem is we're feeding children from a system that is driving so many of the activities that Rosie's talking about, plastic and chemical pollution. I want to get into, in the panel discussion, we're going to be talking more about the structural drivers versus all of our individual responsibility. But I want to introduce our third speaker, Kat Hickey. And Kat, maybe I'm hoping Rosie's talk was very, frankly, it was upsetting, absolutely gripping. I'm wondering if we're going to get more positivity from you. Although, frankly, sometimes I wonder if we deserve any. Kat Hickey is the head of conservation at ZSL, and you spend a lot of time every day trying to introduce young people to nature, improve access to nature in a more equitable way, and working out how we can access better mental health and stronger immunity ourselves through interactions with nature. And Kat also works to remove barriers for underrepresented audiences in developing careers across the conservation sector. So, Kat, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. There is actually quite a bit of hope in this, so we're going to end on a bit of a more positive note. As you said, what I'm here to talk to you about is about that connection that we've been talking about all evening, that One Health isn't just an animal problem, it's not just a human problem. But one of the things that we haven't, when we've been talking about infectious diseases and when we've been talking about health, one of the areas that we haven't talked about is mental health, and there is a crisis. So we've understanding of the climate crisis, understanding of the biodiversity crisis that we're in at the moment, but they aren't separate emergencies. They are deeply entangled, which has been showcased here tonight. But if we go back to Rosie's slide on the chemical pollution and the interconnectedness of human behaviour, linking it to wildlife health and human health, it might just start us off in thinking about the intersection of these. And so what I've just done is overlaid in all of these instances, at every point of the chain is a human, and a human that is making decisions. So from the farmer choosing which pesticides to use, from the policymaker deciding on what to invest in environmental regulation, to the consumer, as Rosie mentioned, choosing what to buy. Now, these can be quite complicated. It isn't just about the knowledge that they have or the economics. But they are people making decisions. And these decisions are shaped by our values. They're by our sense of connection and by the education they receive. But we all know that logic sometimes isn't the deciding factor when policymakers and consumers make decisions. Today, I want to talk to you about the fact that education, specifically the kind of education that builds that genuine connection to nature and to the natural world. It's not soft, it's not an optional extra in the conversation around wildlife health. It is a driver of decisions that determine the outcomes for wildlife health, for ecosystems, and ultimately for us. But I did say it was hopeful. It does get better, I promise. But we just have to look at the human element here first. But let's just take stock of where young people are right now. A recent survey of 3,000 children conducted by Save the Children showed that 70% are worried about the world that they will inherit, with 75% calling on governments to take stronger action on their behalf. 60% felt that climate change and inequality are already affecting the generation's mental health. This isn't confined to the UK. 56% of children globally believe that climate change is causing a deterioration in children's mental health. Between 2022 and 2024, over 400 million students across 81 countries experienced school closures due to extreme weather events. In just 2 months, between April and May 2024 alone, more than 210 million children missed school because of extreme health. In the UK, missing school and absence is a key area that the government is focused on because it drives inequality, it drives lack of learning, and it drives that attainment for those young people. But these children are not yet wrong to be worried. The science backs them. But worry without agency leads to anxiety. And that's exactly where education can play its critical role. Not just by informing, but by equipping. Not just awareness raising, but building the kind of relationship with the natural world that motivates action. So let me introduce you to a concept that sits at the core of ZSL's education approach, nature connectedness. Nature connectedness is not the same as access to nature. It's not time spent in nature. Many of us will spend time in nature that's quite entirely functional. I walked the dog this morning, I cycled to work, but being in nature won't automatically make you feel connected to it. Nor is it the same as knowledge. You can know a great deal about the natural world and feel very little relationship with it. Nature connectedness is something more specific. It describes the quality of the relationship within the natural world, understanding ourselves as part of nature rather than separate from or superior to it. It is the emotional bond that we feel towards it. And critically, it is measurable, it is a psychological scale associated with it, and it is not inherited. It can be improved. So just tackling a few of those misconceptions that we hear a lot, because it can be really easy to talk about a connection to nature. Contact is not connection. The knowledge of it, of understanding of what nature is, doesn't mean it's the nature connectedness. It is about how we see ourselves at an individual level, where we see ourselves in nature. A lot of Indigenous cultures have this kinship with nature, but industrialization has detangled them. We see ourselves as separate. Industrialization has really pulled apart our connection to, our impact and a part of the natural world. We don't also need it to be perfect wild space. When people think about nature connectedness, they think of huge open spaces, national parks. But actually, the research is showing that it doesn't need to be perfect. It can be local because it's not just about the landscape, it's connecting to the nature. And nature, it turns out, is actually still everywhere. We do live in the most nature-depleted country in Europe, but it's still everywhere. We just talked about seeing squirrels, seeing rats, they're still nature, and we hear birds. But it's also not a new idea. Although it is, over the last 25 years, a lot more research in the Western scientific journals are coming through with it, is that psychological science is increasing. But it's not a new idea, and a lot of research has gone into understanding actually how can we build our nature connectedness score, and you can actually go and do your score. So I would advocate for everyone to go and find out, because you're here, your score is probably quite high. But what we do know is also that mentally, time in natural environments is consistently associated with lower rates of depression and anxiety. And I just thought you might like looking at this because it will reduce your anxiety and your state of depression while I talk. Studies show that 30 minutes in a green or a blue space reduces stress hormones, blood pressure. Nature gives us, as humans, perspective, a connection to something larger than ourselves, linked to greater emotional resilience and self-awareness. For children and for students, that access to learn in and about nature supports their attention, it supports behavioural difficulties, it supports attainment. It is particularly beneficial for those with additional needs or for mental distress. Physically living near green space is associated with lower rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and all-cause mortality. It increases the likelihood of physical activity and strengthens social cohesion in communities. There's even neurological evidence. Proximity to forests has been shown to support the integrity of amygdala, the part of the brain that processes stress and emotion. This is from a study, and it's just, yes, one study, but it gives some indications. It's useful to move away from that broad associations into whether, if brief exposure to nature can change stress-related brain activity. Participants were scanned before and after a 60-minute walk. The walk took place either in an urban forest or within a busy street. Participants walked alone, a fixed route, and then returned for repeat testing. The study tests whether the environment can shift brain responses over a short period of time. The main focus is the amygdala, which is involved in threat detection and stress processing. And in the scanner, participants completed a fearful faces task to assess reactivity. Before the walk, what you'll see is that actually they're quite similar. The two groups look quite similar. After walk, the nature group showed a drop in amygdala activity. The urban group did not show the same reduction. This should not be overstated, but it does show that one walk in nature, and it does not mean that one walk in nature transforms mental health, but it does suggest that brief nature exposure may reduce stress-related activity in the brain, and this helps a more biological plausible to help explain why greener settings may support stress recovery. But what's really exciting for conservationists is that quality counts. So it doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be big wild landscape, but the biodiversity does actually have an impact on our nature connectedness and our mental health. But natural spaces can be defined as green spaces, parks, woodlands, forests, rivers, or blue spaces of wetlands, canals, beaches, but it also includes urban streets, grass verges, bird boxes, hedgehog boxes, but it's the quality that counts. And the evidence shows us that that has the positive impact on our well-being. Now, this is where I get really excited, and this is where it gets more hopeful. Here is where the science becomes particularly compelling for anyone working in conservation and wildlife health. Research from 75 studies has demonstrated a causal link between nature connectedness and pro-environmental behaviours. Not just a correlation, a causal link. People who feel genuinely connected to nature are more likely to take action to protect it. One study of children aged 9 to 11 is particularly striking. Environmental knowledge explained 2% of the variance in the pro-nature behaviour. Nature connectedness explains 69%. Knowledge was 2%, nature connectedness was 69%. Knowing facts is not enough. The relationship is what drives the behaviour. And when we look at this through a One Health lens, the implications are enormous. Think about the decision makers that we were just talking about, every node of the systems that affect those wildlife health, from the farming practices and the chemical use to the waste management and sewage treatment and policy. At each of these points, there are people with different levels of influence, different levels of connection to the natural world. The higher that connection, the more likely that they are to make the decisions that protect it. Nature connectedness is also associated with what researchers call climate worry. And crucially, climate worry is linked to positive action, not paralysis. Connected people don't just care more, they do more. So if connection drives conservation behaviour, when does that connection start to break down? Think about how we educate children from the very start in the UK. And I want you all to do something. I want you to stop and think about one gift that you have ever brought for a newborn. It could be your own, your family, a family member's. Children's books are full of animals, insects, seasons, wonder, our senses, the gruffalo, the snail and the whale, the tiger who came to tea. Now think about our education system. The UK's early years foundation stage curriculum centres on outdoor play, exploration, developing a sense of the world. And then as children move through primary school and into the secondary school, something happens. Desks replace logs, pens replace sticks, interactive whiteboards replace clouds. At the age of 9, levels of nature connectedness drop significantly. And research shows that it not recover for about 20 years. At the precise moment when adolescents are forming their identities, understanding their place in the world, and when rates of mental health difficulty are at their highest, we systematically remove them from the very environment that could be supporting them. At the cost of that is not just well-being, although the evidence is clear that nature connectedness significantly supports mental health, but the cost is also a generation of future decision makers that never had the chance to build a meaningful relationship with the natural world they are going to be responsible for. Here at ZSL, we think about education as a pipeline, not as a one-off encounter, but a sustained and intentional relationship with nature and conservation, and we can support this from the earliest years through to career-level expertise. One of the most significant barriers to accessing nature, and specifically conservation and veterinary medicine, is the belief that fields are not for people like me. And that is ZSL's new Wildlife Health Centre is being deliberately designed to bring science out from behind the closed doors, allowing the public to see veterinary and conservation science in action, rather than hearing about it in theory. Our community and education programs are centred around removing these barriers and creating the opportunities for people to have that wow moment, to build curiosity and connection. And that's why we're extremely excited about the Wildlife Health Centre, because we know what works. We know that inspiration moment that we can all go back to, of that when we saw an animal or seeing that, do something and that. But continuing to build on that pathway through building skills and knowledge, and then actually strengthening that critical thinking, curiosity and leadership. And you can see that then through our early years programming, so our wildlife health pathway. Our early years program, such as Zootown, is designed not just to expose children to animals, but to build the emotional relationship to caring for animals that the research tells us are the precursor to pro-nature behaviour. This is not soft work. This is strategic. When we talk through our community and our schools access scheme, We talk about our Inside Nature program, understanding the barriers of our location. So how do we break down those barriers? By creating digital resources that can be in every school, that takes our veterinary work into the school, that puts that curriculum into context, putting an understanding of why we have these curriculums, why we're doing this learning, but connecting it back to caring for the animals. You then keep going on from, we're always looking at what that next step for a young person is, so that we are there to support them without that drop. So be it a Wildlife Careers Conference, our work experience program, our Insight into Vet Days, all through to our undergraduate work with veterinaries, all the way through to our interventions in wildlife health program and our professional development. Because the opening up the access to the process is about noticing nature. It's about training the people that will move on to making those decisions, to care about wildlife, and to supporting those that go into the career to be able to have that knowledge, that expertise, to be able to drive those conversations. Across all of these, our education framework is a consistent logic, raising that awareness and empathy and connection and decision making, building the knowledge and skills, inspiring that behaviour change, but also giving them the agency to do that. It is about creating positive decision makers at every level of influence in the future, from consumers to policy makers. And if anyone tells you that young people do not have influence over the decisions that their adults around them make, just ask anyone, did they want to go to the soft play? So let me close about this. Education is not optional, it is causal. When we talk about the threats to wildlife health, chemical pollution, habitat destruction, zoonotic disease risk, we often focus on the systems and the science is vital. But at every node in those systems, there are people making decisions. Whether someone acts in a way to protect or degrade the wildlife health depends not primarily on what they know, but how they relate, on whether they see the natural world as something they belong to and feel responsible for. Nature connectedness, that quality of relationship to the natural world, is not a byproduct of good conservation education. It's its purpose. And when we get it right, the impact can be huge. Thank you.
Kat, thank you so much. I've never, ever enjoyed soft play, and as someone with a background in virology, I think it is one of the most hazardous environments on the planet. Can I invite the three of you to come and sit in the order we discussed, and while you put your mics on, my first question, and I want the three of you to answer this one by one, is we have been talking about this emerging crisis for a long time. Rachel Carson published her book Silent Spring in the 1960s. David Attenborough has just celebrated his 100th birthday, and his career has borne witness to a catastrophic destruction of the natural world and our planetary ecosystems. So my question for each of you is, what single thing would you want to do if you could that would help fix and promote a One Health agenda? What piece of the puzzle are we missing? What barrier needs to be overcome? And I'm going to ask each of you, we'll start with Rosie, to answer this. And you can be small, you can be micro, you can be macro. But yeah, each have a go at this, and then I'll come to the audience.
I think for me, it's kind of back to the point I made in my talk, which might be a cop-out. But it's the economic incentives across a lot of these problems. So from chemical pollution that we talked about, but equally climate change, these large companies are not paying for the costs that their products or their actions are causing to the environment. So if we were to take into account what climate change is going to cost us globally and add that to the price of oil, you very quickly might see behaviour change around choosing alternatives that would support a One Health agenda. I think the same is true when we look at pandemics, when we look at habitat destruction, and when we look at chemical pollution. So I think if there's some way that we can make it so that the economic incentives are correct for us to take the right actions, then that would be my very easy solution.
Okay, the externalized costs is the way we do that. And there is a framework we are increasingly using in public health called the commercial determinants of health. We talked a lot about the political determinants. We used to talk about the social determinants. I think in terms of human health, there is growing evidence that it is these commercial incentives that are the primary influence of your life expectancy and your quality of life. Javi, I'll come to you.
I think for me, it's the general mindset that we all have, not only the people, but institutions and governments, and we tend to react to things and not think in prevention and thinking about things before things happen. So we always, every time, you have talked about the hantavirus stuff or the Ebola stuff, we are all the time reacting to these events. We are not kind of being prepared for them. And we have, for example, the COVID pandemic. It came, we did a lot of things. A lot of money was spent on things. We put a lot of work into it. But then time passed, and then we forget about those things. And then they go back in the kind of in the drawer for the next crisis to us kind of to react to them.
You never get rewarded in public health for the pandemic that you prevent. That's a sort of axiom. Kat?
I think the bit where I would want a change is that, and I'm going to cop out as well, it's going to be education, but it's around where people feel they have power around the decisions that people can make. And I think we do have a very short memory of smoking in cinemas, of smoking inside in bars, of being, plastic bags and being able to get them for free. And we can drive change as a population, but we need to care about it and we need to know what to do. And so for me, it's that being able to really connect people and where we can see it is actually having access to nature in education, but also in actually putting real pressure on policymakers across the board to be able to make nature-based solutions, because we do know that you have to make it harder for humans to make the pro-nature decisions as well. It can't just be that fuel is the same price as going on a bike. It has to be that the bike is easier than everything else to do to make that pro-environmental behavior. But people fundamentally have to care, and being able to make a policy shift around actually valuing nature as part of our decision-making could be transformational.
So I think there's a really helpful thing that you've formalized, which I think almost is it's the other end of that spectrum that Rosie's talking about, where in order to change the commercial incentives and create the structures and create the policies, you need to create a movement. You need public support. You need a mandate for action. And I think you've been very convincing about your theory of change and how you're doing that in a way that I was sort of expecting, but you exceeded expectations. I want to sit here and ask them questions all night, but that's not why I'm here. Hopefully I can email them later. Are there questions from the audience? Stick your hand up.
First of all, thanks for the amazing range of talks, and really diverse across all ranges. My question is particularly for Kat, and I really like the way you sort of focus and pick out what needs to be done, and in terms of getting that connection with sort of kids especially. And just on one particular point, thinking about how kids will form the future, or do form the future, what's your view on the digital world? Because you mentioned digital materials. Do you think overall we're going to get a greater nature connectedness from the influence of the digital world on the kids, or do you think overall the sort of surge in digitization is a bad thing?
I love that. When I'm scrolling my nature hashtags on the reels, is that working? A brilliant question. Thank you, Kat.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's a question that actually, so we're working in a pilot program with the NHS and with some schools around understanding around the digital use as well as health and nature-based education. And in one of the things that we have to remember is that for some young people, the way they communicate and the way they can connect to people, especially in special educational needs or disabilities, is through a screen. So we need to be quite careful when we're talking about screen time. But it is a balance. And for me, it is a balance of utilizing the technology that we have, but ensuring that we are changing the algorithm towards maybe a more positive nature algorithm rather than a harmful algorithm. And I think for us, where ZSL approaches digital, is that we have certain locations. You know, we have our 2 conservation zoos in London at Whipsnade. And for us to be able to reach people beyond the boundaries of the UK, being able to visit us, then that is where our digital footprint comes in. And if we really want to start looking at the ability to be able to support the training capacity of biodiversity hotspots, where these where One Health can really be at the crux of where it starts, then actually digital is going to be paramount to that work.
We've got another question at the front here.
Our farming soil will be depleted in all its nutrients in a few years' time, so I read. This in turn depletes our immunity system from lack of nutrients, which increases chronic diseases and early death. How can we stop this emergency? Because millions are dying of chronic diseases all over the world at the moment.
I'm going to throw that to Javier. Rosie, I'm going to look at Rosie because I think you're good on the structural stuff. I can also maybe help out, but I'm here to support you.
It was soil
depletion. Which I think is a real phenomenon. We're going to lose our topsoil. That's leading to micronutrient and nutrient deficiencies, amongst other things.
Yeah.
That's causing reduced immunity and ecological collapse. If you've got a thought on, and I guess maybe a wider reflection on power, and I want the power is the theme I kind of want to drag you all back to, because I think that's where I'm going to try and conclude.
Yeah, I think it's a short-term thinking as a problem. So I think some of the reasons for that issue with soil is the way that agriculture is happening and the chemicals that are being used to grow our food. And there are several reasons why we need that amount of chemicals or the specific types of chemicals, including habitat destruction, demand for food, land use change, etc. And the decisions are made, and I know I need to be short, but the decisions are made for that year for that farmer, because they need to pay their bills and they need to have a farm, it needs to be a business. And so they need the help to make the right choice that means we're not going to deplete our soil, and it means that for the next generation, that's a productive farm. So we need to take this longer term thinking and support people in making the right choice so that we don't have that degradation.
I think a lot of these commercial questions are best understood if you think of this half of the room running a farm or a company or a plastics factory, and this half of the room also running an adversarial plastics factory or farm or paint company or oil refinery, whatever it would be. And unless you're forbidden from doing the things that harm the planet, if those things save you money, you will more or less be forced to do it by your owners and your investors. And so if you understand the commercial incentives, that's where we can interrupt it. And I think all of you have spoken very powerfully about that. We've got, hold your hands up high so I can see. I want to get around the room. We've got 2 here. Let's do a couple here, and then I'm going to head to the back there.
My question is actually, I'm not sure who it's best to kind of direct it at, but I've been really interested in kind of looking at housing as kind of the very, very core and base of a lot of the things that we struggle with in a society. And there was a conversation I was having with a Green Party councillor where they were like, oh yeah, there's not enough houses. And and they were also saying about, for example, issues of like pollution and people putting rubbish like in the cities. So I wonder how housing affects this kind of One Health thing, especially because we stay in urban areas as well.
What I was going to just specifically say the way that One Health is so interconnectedness, social justice and environmental justice are interconnected. And so one doesn't, so the drivers of our decision making are not are interdependent. And so you cannot have environmental justice without social justice. And I would say that's where housing comes in.
I love it so much. And there may be more questions on that. But yes, these things are not in conflict. There's far less conflict than we would think between these different agendas. There's a question in front.
Cool. My name's Charlotte. I did a degree in One Health. My question would be, how do we keep people engaged with the cost of living, and also how do we do it without scaring them, with things like bird flu being a massive concern in the agricultural industry? How do we keep people engaged and trying to make the right choices without scaring them, but also keeping it affordable, I guess?
Javi, but how do we, bird flu versus cost of living?
Yeah. I think for me, the best way is to keep things close to people and make things relevant for people. We can talk a lot about global pandemics. We can talk about avian influenza, Ebola in Congo, but maybe people are more engaged if you are also talking about local issues, the ticks in the park, the foxes have this, or that something that people can identify with and that they are invested in, and that way you can kind of build up from the close things and things that people understand to bigger problems like avian influenza, Ebola, or Nipah, whatever. The cost of living, that's an issue that is happening to everyone all over the world. I don't know if I'm qualified to talk about that.
Well, Kat, do you want to pick up this? Javi's in the biology and the ecosystem. Do you want to pick up a bit on that justice theme and how we reconcile? I mean, poultry farming might be the one area where there are serious difficulties between the environment, the phosphate in the rivers, free range, bird flu. It might be the one example of a wicked problem.
Yeah, and I think it was a really good question of how do you keep people engaged, and we learned a lot around how to keep people engaged, and it isn't through scaring people, and it's not through belittling people, and it's not thinking that actually you can solve everything from just asking them to notice nature. There's interconnectedness, and that's why we were saying social justice is connected to environmental justice. But we do know that hope actually goes a long way of people keeping connected, that we know the cost of living crisis is driving a mental health crisis and a public health crisis. And actually, when we start looking at nature-based solutions at a whole complex level rather than an individual level, then actually we are starting to hold people accountable. Because again, it is the cost of living crisis is people making certain decisions. And so we have to bring that back to that One Health approach around understanding why certain drivers are being pushed, and it is economics, and that actually that's an extremely difficult position. But one of the things that we can start doing also in terms of is putting pressure on access to nature, actually calling for that equitable access to nature and green and blue spaces, because that isn't going to be solving the cost of living crisis, but actually it can unburden the physical and the NHS crisis that actually then starts looking at where you're distributing the pot of money as well.
Let's take an online question, if we can.
we can do one online. That would be amazing. So this one comes from Morwenna online, who says that the risks to human, animal, and environmental health often appear to be higher in the global south, but they're often not fairly involved or represented in decision making. How can the more affluent global north help to combat this inequity in order to achieve One Health?
Javi, you've spoken about the famous Nipah virus crisis, but that was a sort of microcosm of a much bigger problem.
I think the main thing is that we have to understand that everything that happens in other places end up affecting us. Of course, we have better surveillance systems in Europe. We have a lot of things much more developed than in other countries. But how the world is now we may have people in Congo now that will be in Heathrow in 12 hours, and then we'll be walking around the city in here. So we have to be conscious that these type of problems are not Congo problems or Malaysia problems. These are global problems that all institutions and all governments and everyone have to kind of work together to solve, I think.
A really important question online. We've got a gentleman there with the mic. Go for it, sir.
Okay, Clive, no affiliation at all. Just a question, sort of slightly the other way around, is there something we can learn from animals? Because the only thing that we have as humans throughout our whole life is our body. And we often don't do enough walking or steps or movement. We eat bad things, we put on weight and so on. So I was wondering if there's something we could learn going the other direction.
Oh, I love that question. Can I just make sure I understand it, that wild animals live a particular life, and is one of our ways of reconnecting to our health and our life to imagine maybe the way we have evolved to live? Rosie, can I get you to talk about that?
Yeah, I think it's a lovely question, and 100% short answer is yes, absolutely. I think it's a really good example because it came up in my house yesterday. My partner was saying how our bed's too comfy and actually we'd have much less muscle pain, et cetera, et cetera. There's all this evidence that sleeping on a hard bed is better for you, you know. And I was just thinking, it always comes back in my head to like, what would the cave man or woman be doing? And they've evolved to be sleeping on a hard floor in a cave. So I think absolutely, like when you look at food and ultra-processed food, what have we evolved as humans over thousands of years to be doing? And the answer is not, you know, not exercising, eating properly, etc. So yeah, I think it's a really good point.
The more we notice nature, the more humans will be better. And we will be better decision makers by looking more at our non-human relatives. But in terms of, just to come on, in terms of the animals in the zoos, it is evidence-based enrichment and decision-making on trying to make sure that as much natural behaviours are exhibited in our zoos. And so that will be throughout the behaviours, and then we teach students to be able to look at those behaviours and be able to understand the behaviours and be able to learn from those behaviours and be able to test those behaviours through scientific research. And so a lot of it will be us supporting the students to actually take notice of the communication between the lemurs.
I want to finish with a question to each of you. Kat, you referenced the idea of cigarette smoking, that we've seen, in spite of all the gloom we can reference, we have had some triumphs in public health: leaded petrol, seatbelts in cars, asbestos, and most importantly, cigarette smoking. If we'd given this talk 20 years ago, I think we would have been allowed 30 years ago, we would have been allowed to smoke in this room, definitely. We were allowed until quite recently. But 30 years ago, we probably would have been smoking, and now it is illegal, obviously. I'd love from each of you an example, either a source of optimism or a triumph from your own field where we have got something right and a lesson has been learned, or a lesson we might learn from. Rosie, shall I start with you?
Yeah, I've got a really specific marine mammal one, so we'll go there. So those pollutants that I talked about, PCBs, back in the 1970s, they weren't yet collectively banned. And the Baltic grey seal had very low pregnancy rates, and there was tumours and occlusions in their reproductive tracts. As soon as the concentrations of these pollutants in the environment reduced, pregnancy rates almost identically went up, and these tumours disappeared. And so nature really did recover very quickly. Predators returned to that ecosystem, and it was a real success story. And now you see lots of cute great Baltic seal pups and nurseries all around. And so I think it's just a really clear example of nature is resilient and can recover when we do the right thing.
I love that. Javi?
I think I will give the corny question, the corny answer, and it will be the people in here and the people online, and the statistics that Kat show about young people being invested in what, like, animal health, environmental health, and all these kind of things, because that's what will make things change. We can say whatever we want, we can think whatever we want, but if people are not invested in the topic, there is nothing to do, and this shows that people are invested in the topic.
I love that, but Javi, you may have stolen Kat's answer. Kat, you've got to...
No, it's okay. Ours is actually, one of mine is actually closer to the work that we do here, is that we see that nature-based education works. So we work a huge amount with young people that are at risk or already not in education, employment or training. And through the programming that we do, we see reinvestment in post-16 outcomes. And for me, that is wider, not just for that individual, but that individual doesn't become a statistic, and that individual doesn't get forgotten. And that has a huge impact, not just on that individual, but actually on social cohesion, community and society. So that to me is a success, because that is being picked up. That nature-based education in and about nature is being picked up. We are seeing more research into it, and policymakers are taking note. And we see that through from every level, but also at the COPs, where biodiversity, we're making the connections between biodiversity, between climate change, between social justice, between education, and that for me is really exciting.
I think the three of you have made an incredibly powerful case, and you've all referenced all of you. I want to thank our three speakers, but also to thank all of you for showing up. I'm very persuaded that the mandate for action comes from people like the people in this room and the people online, and I can't think of a better place to locate action and to give resources, if you have resources to give, than to ZSL and the amazing work that we've heard about, and the amazing work that's coming up in the next year. There are more talks. The next ZSL Wild Talk is going to be on the 23rd of June. It's from Zoo Time to Spring Watch, Wildlife on Screen, and you can check the events page on the ZSL website for more information. Just remains for me to say thank you to all of you, and all of you for coming, and have a very good night.